Our next panel, titled The Next Phase of the Networks Competition, will be moderated by Daniella Cheslow, Deputy Tech Editor at Politico. Please welcome our speakers. The Honorable Grace Koh, Vice President of Government Relations at Ciena Corporation. The Honorable Rob Blair, former Assistant to the President and Special Representative for International Telecommunications Policy under President Trump. Tom Power, former Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CTIA, and Jon Pelson, author of Wireless Wars.
Sound good. I'm just sit on the edge of my seat.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Daniella Cheslow. I'm Deputy Tech Editor at Politico here in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to be talking about competition in networks. In 2019, the first Trump administration raised the alarm that Chinese companies had leapt ahead of the US in 5G networks. And now, more than 5 years later, we're going to be talking on this panel on the state of competition in 5G and other networking technologies. Questions like how have plans for advanced networks evolved to meet the exploding demands of AI infrastructure, and what policy moves the US should take to ensure that it can compete. We have some experts here to lend their years of experience and knowledge to answer these questions. Grace Koh is Vice President of Government Relations at Ciena. Before that, she served as Special Assistant to the President for Technology, Telecom, and Cybersecurity Policy at the National Economic Council and headed the US delegation to the International Telecommunication Union during the Trump administration. Thanks for being here, Grace. Rob Blair is former assistant, Rob Blair over here, is former assistant to the president and special representative to the International Telecommunications Policy during Trump's first term. He also spent several years at Microsoft with a focus on national security, government, and emerging technology. Jon Pelson is the author of Wireless Wars, China's Dangerous Domination of 5G and How We're Fighting Back. And Tom Power is the founder of Big Star LLC. He served in the Obama White House as Deputy CTO, and after that worked as Senior Vice President and General Counsel of CTIA, the Wireless Association. Grace, I'm going to start with you. Your firm, Ciena, focuses on optical fiber networks. What can you tell us about why Americans should care about our networking infrastructure, and what specific actions the US should take to build out these optical networks faster?
Right. Well, thanks so much for having me, first of all. And this is a great panel. I know most of the people here, so I usually take their word as gospel. I would say, so Ciena plays very heavily in the optical networking space. I don't think there's anyone that can really compete with Ciena when it comes to moving bits long distances. And anyone, it's not a household name, but it is becoming much more, the portfolio that Ciena covers is becoming much more pressing, much more urgent as we continue to build out data centers for the increasing penetration of AI through society. And what you're seeing as the data center architecture continues to build is the need for increasing capacity in data center interconnects. Optical technology is what drives a lot of what advances our ability to pass data between data centers, between racks and other large language models. So to the extent that we care at all, and this administration does care about how fast we're moving towards the commercialization and the advancement of AI, we do need to care about the networks that carry the data that both train and also carry out inferences and back to the user.
And all of this is happening domestically as we're facing a fierce competition with China. And Jon, the next question's for you. You've been warning for years that the US has to jump ahead on wireless. I'd like to hear your take on why we haven't quite managed, why Huawei has stayed ahead of the US, even though we've heard alarms for years and even added the company to the US entity list.
Yeah, and when you say they've stayed ahead of the US, it's true. I would say the US dropped out of the race. There's no real players of any material size left. You know, Bell Labs, Nortel, Motorola, all gone effectively.
Even Ciena?
Well, there's
players
players
space.
In certain spaces. It's right. You got Cisco. You have players that are great at what they do. In fact, that's the key. Is that the market for wireless today is still based on company scale. You get lower cost, better distribution. You can invest more. And so Huawei's going to win that. As long as that's the game, Huawei will win 5G, 6G, and beyond. And the IP just has to get licensed anyway. So the trick, people look to Open RAN as a possible path. That hasn't really happened yet. It may not, but at least something like that plays to trusted ecosystem scale. And that's a game China will never be able to compete as well. So there's been a push to move things where Huawei's bigger than anybody, but they're not bigger than everybody. And if you could have Dell and HP and Fujitsu, if you have Ciena and Cisco all engaging in an alternative to a single built network, then maybe you have a solution that just hasn't happened yet. And that's why we're still relying on the Nordic, the stalking horses really, to just at least be in the game.
I want to have Jon Pelson's comment. I'd like to turn that now to Rob Blair, because my political colleague, John Hendel, interviewed you in 2020, so quite some time back. And you spoke then about how the US could build upon what made it the dominant economy in the world and ensure that, quote, within not 10 years, but a matter of several years, the US would regain its rightful place in 5G. Building on what John just said, how did that prediction of yours work out?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody, and Ely and Obear and the rest of the SCSP crew. You guys really do some incredible thinking on policy and getting it into the right stages of government. So thank you for the work that you all do. Now, to this question, let's look back to where we were in 2018. We weren't at the federal government even having a conversation around what a strategic technology was. There was no real appreciation of, or there was appreciation but no implementation in terms of policy on what China was doing to identify strategic technologies in Made in China 2025, build its own internal incentive structures around them, and then drive using its international reach the collection of intellectual property, as well as the manipulation of market forces in order to dominate, in this case, the 5G technology space. They are not exclusive to 5G. These sorts of activities are happening across the technology space. But at the time, we began to understand the strategic implications of how the 5G dominance by the Chinese is going to affect our geostrategic concerns, not just with the United States, but also with our allies. What we did not appreciate, and something that I've been working to address ever since then, is that the private sector did not have a profit incentive at that point to truly invest its innovation and their internal dollars into building out 5G. It didn't exist. The federal government was moving from a posture of not having an industrial policy to what eventually came the CHIPS Act and other initiatives into industrial policy. But we were kind of caught in that spectrum change and had not yet oriented US taxpayer dollars into building out that in this case, the 5G tech stack. As we move forward from 5G into other areas like cloud technologies, like quantum, we have to make sure that we understand that if we're going to be relying upon the private sector, as we must in the United States, we do not have a civil-military fusion process as they have in China, then we have to come up with ways for government to incentivize industry to use their own research and development dollars, as well as their own capital dollars. Microsoft puts about $30 billion a quarter into data centers. Google does the same thing. Amazon does the same thing. The entire federal government's budget for the Department of Energy is around $25 to $30 billion, and that's not including the nuclear energy side. So we have to find ways for the government to incentivize the private sector to pursue technologies which may not necessarily be immediately profitable. We're still working in that direction. We're much farther today than we were 5 years ago, but we still have a ways to go.
Tom, I wanted to talk to you. You know, when we talk about the spectrum of change, as Rob mentioned, I also wanted to talk about actual spectrum itself. And that's something where I think we see a lot of the tensions between the government and different agencies. This is something that you had specialized in at the CTIA. Can you explain to us, why does spectrum matter when we talk about networks? And how does the argument today over whether to allocate more spectrum, how does that look today?
Well, the importance of spectrum can't be overstated. You know, it supports everything we do at work, everything we do at play. It's central to every vertical industry, and those industries will continue to build on spectrum as we go into the future, whether you're talking about manufacturing, agriculture, education, healthcare, transportation, as well as consumer uses. I think as we move into 6G in particular, it seems like maybe the focus will be more on the B2B side of things. But we are exploiting spectrum to our great advantage in terms of things like GDP. And at the end of the day, we know that investment, smart policy leads to good investment, leads to innovation, and that builds economic security and national security, particularly vis-a-vis China. So that importance can't be overstated. In terms of where we stand now, I can't help but note that Sunday will be the second anniversary of the lapse of the FCC's authority to generally auction spectrum. The United States essentially perfected spectrum auctions 30 years ago. The rest of the world followed our lead. It has led to hundreds of billions of dollars in capital expenditures by the industry, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue for the Treasury in terms of auction proceeds, and huge productivity gains. The fact that we've allowed that to lapse for 2 years is almost incomprehensible. And I'm not saying that licensed spectrum is the only game here. We have fallen behind China and other countries when it comes to licensed spectrum. But Wi-Fi is important. These folks couldn't be checking their emails right now without Wi-Fi. Satellite is becoming more and more important, especially solving ubiquity, the ubiquitous challenge. But we really need to get back that spectrum authority and make sure that we are back competing with the rest of the world when it comes to the allocation of spectrum.
I'd love to talk with Grace a little bit more about spectrum. We know in Congress right now there is conversation around possibly freeing up some of the mid-band spectrum, but that's something that, although Ted Cruz has been advocating, there's some resistance at the Pentagon and among some of the Senate Armed Forces committee members. Can you kind of sketch out where there might be movement on spectrum in Congress and what might be the place for the Trump administration to just lean in and say, hey, we're doing it this way?
Could you not actually ask Tom about that? Because honest, this is a tough question. Honestly, there's DoD and well, all right, the federal agencies writ large and and commercial interests have been pretty much at loggerheads, particularly over this mid-band spectrum. Industry is particularly interested in it because there is a certain amount of harmonization that you can do with other countries that have already allocated mid-band spectrum. DoD, however, particularly with the U.S. Military might, has requires a spectrum for a number of mission-critical applications, and it's not easily repurposed. It's not easily removed. Even if this spectrum were to be reallocated, moving the assets off of that particular band of spectrum would take a significant amount of time, perhaps even too long. So where is there possible movement? So I was fortunate enough to lead the US delegation to the World Radio Communication Conference. If sides are willing to talk about specifically about what they need, talk about where the power requirements can be shifted a bit, talk about geographies where you can actually operate in a more fulsome way. It's in these nitty-gritty details that you're able to usually find a path. Is it satisfactory to everybody? Maybe, maybe not. But that discussion also typically doesn't happen without usually White House guidance of some sort in order to be able to force the entities together and to actually come to the bargaining table and really work this out.
Could I just jump in on that? I agree with everything Grace said, but there are two things that are really holding things up on the Hill. One is, once the FCC is reauthorized to do spectrum, what do we do with the revenues? And just their competing interests on the Hill as to where that money goes. The other is the issue of, typically when Congress reauthorizes the FCC, they actually mandate auctions. They don't just authorize them, they mandate them, because otherwise they tend not to happen. The agencies are very focused on their missions, which are very spectrum dependent, and they're not as focused necessarily. They are very diligent, very professional, very hardworking, very underappreciated, underpaid, but they don't always focus as much, I think, on the broader picture. I say that with all respect. And so having Congress mandate that some portion of spectrum actually be auctioned, not just authorized to auction, but mandating it, is the other thing that's getting hung up on the Hill, because there are folks who are in favor of just general auction authority, and we'll leave it at that.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the place of Huawei and ZTE kit in both the American telecom space and among our allies. Late last year, Congress authorized $3 billion for rip and replace. But we've been also talking to our allies in Europe, the US, about getting Huawei out of their telecom systems, and many of our European allies still have it it's pretty prolific. Rob, I was wondering how some of the recent White House moves, whether it's pausing aid to Ukraine or threatening tariffs on Europe, how does that affect our ability to move together with our allies on telecom? And can that be done independently, even if some of the other issues like military cooperation or tariffs are more of an open question?
Well, I'm not going to say those moves help with international cooperation, certainly. Listen, when we were working in the early days on Huawei and ZTE policy, one of my jobs was to travel around the world and have private conversations, mostly with the defense and intelligence officials, about what we knew about Huawei and what we knew about ZTE and how they could use the technologies for purposes that were not in the US national interest. It took a lot of trust building at that point. I'm worried that, of course, if we have to have some other conversations, we're going to be starting at ground zero today. A lot still needs to be done domestically. Even setting aside the international component, much needs to be done domestically. Rip and replace, another $3 billion has been authorized. Rural telecommunication providers are still struggling to figure out how to get access to that money, how to put it into place, how to get what they've known for years to be untrustworthy hardware out of their systems. And we think about rural America. I'm a redneck dirt farmer from Illinois, and I spend a lot of time on the Great Plains. I go out west, so I've done work with the nuclear stockpile, nuclear weapons, and nuclear delivery systems. Rural America is where our nuclear deterrent lies. If it's not under the ocean, it's in rural America. So these telecommunication providers are actually in key strategic areas, and we need to make sure that those systems are as secure as possible. Last month, maybe it's 2 months ago now, Sol Typhoon, maybe it's 3 months ago now, Sol Typhoon attacked the lawful intercept system of our telecommunication system, probably the most successful cybersecurity attack on US infrastructure. It came in through back doors that were there for reasonable purposes. As a government and as an industry, we need to be investing more money into making sure that our hardware is as secure as possible, that the code running on it is as secure as possible, and that encryption standards, and I'll talk more about this later, encryption standards are not just suitable for today, but also for a quantum future.
I'm going to stay on this topic of geopolitical moves and ask Grace, we've been talking about tariffs recently. Will there be tariffs? Won't there? There are tariffs. They're rescinded, but only for cars, but maybe for everything. Can you talk about how tariffs affect the operation of Ciena, but also the telecom industry writ large? Where are things being made and researched, and how do tariffs impact the bottom line?
So you're giving me the opportunity to lobby the room. I'm kind of enjoying that. Quite honestly, obviously, the instability that the tariff situation has created is not fantastic for business. I don't think I need to belabor that with you all. For a lot of telecommunications equipment manufacturers, production does happen in Mexico, especially for the geographic region of North America. A lot of telecommunications companies have begun to reduce their dependence on components from China already with the advent of the first administration. That signal was sent loudly and clearly. A lot of the components, at least for equipment in the North American region and the South American region, that reliance has been significantly reduced, but economics have dictated that they produce in places like Mexico. So in that instance, and for Ciena particularly, and for a number of our competitors, there is a significant, I would say, R&D and production basis also in Canada. So the North American tower situation is quite troubling for all of us there. This is what you would not do in order to be able to advance the telecommunications ecosystem and our race to AI. I hate to call it a race, but it was the easiest way of expressing what's happening.
Speaking of the race to AI, Jon, I wanted to ask you, there are areas where the US appears to maintain its edge in technology, and certainly AI is one of them. I wondered how you perceived DeepSeek and what looked like matching American performance for less money in chips. Does this pose a wider warning for regaining the lead on 5G?
Well, it does, and I first want to just mention a comment Rob made about the rip and replace program. Rob was working on this 6, 7 years ago in a classified sense 4 years ago from open source, I wrote about it. Congress, with remarkable speed, authorized billions of dollars to tear out the Huawei gear and replace it with trusted equipment. And I'm proud to say that today, it's only about 92% of our nuclear missile bases are served by Huawei equipment.
Only 92%, thank you.
It's moving quickly. I'd say by the end of the century, most of it is going to be out. It is dumbfounding, though, that this is how our own bureaucracy works. And believe me, the CCP is very well aware of our own inability to move quickly on these issues. They work the way they do for a reason. You talk about AI and DeepSeek. This was an interesting example, too, of China doing what they're so good at. I argue, certainly in wireless wars, that our advantage is cultural, in that in China, if you are a troublemaker, if you think differently, if you try to tear down institutions with breakthrough ideas, you're out digging ditches on a farm very quickly. I mean, Jack Ma ended up grading quizzes in Tokyo, and he was the richest man in the country. He gave one speech where he said the wrong thing. So what China is great at, besides just hard work and kind of hanging in there, is doing more with less. And that you can go back thousands of years for that. And that's what DeepSeek looked like. We can't get all the chips we want. Either we can't afford them or they're entity list barred. And they took it. They also did something else that China's great at, which is the deception, stealing IP. And there's a lot of evidence that's come in now that a lot of their brilliance and breakthroughs were either IP protected in the US or just ideas that were introduced years ago in the US. And they were applying it much better, frankly, than we do. And so that's a worry. If we try to do it, if we try to play China's game, we will lose. We have to play to our strength, which is disruptive, trusted ecosystems of vendors. It's another disadvantage. I like to tell people the world trusts America. And that's a great laugh line right now. But the fact is, well, compared to who? Compared to China? Yes. We're a more trusted player, if for no other reason, because there's a rule of law here, there's a judicial system where we'll protect IP. And we have to play to that, relying on other partners around the world and working together to develop superior technology, not saying we're going to put a government initiative here and fund it, and this will beat China's initiatives.
Tom, would you agree that the world trusts America as a punchline? And what does that mean for building up the kind of alliances that we were just hearing John say are so important?
Yeah, I think John is spot on. And just to dig a little deeper on it, as having been in the trenches from both the private sector and in the government role, there's a lot of collaboration that has to go on here. And everybody in this room, if you read the memos to the president, you know that a lot of what SCSP focuses on is how to collaborate between the private and public sector. It's just really challenging. If you think about different federal agencies who have overlapping jurisdiction, but different statutory authorities and different statutory responsibilities. You have congressional committees of overlapping jurisdiction, but again, separate constituencies and maybe sometimes egos get involved. On the industry side, you have companies that want to just beat the pants off of each other, but have to collaborate on standards development. And when the industry is talking to government, that can be extremely productive in terms of collaborating to identify and mitigate threats. But industry is always a little nervous about voluntary collaboration turning into prescriptive mandates. And so we're trying to solve for all these things. I agree with Grace that one thing that can help, the White House can help in terms of driving and convening. But stopping short of thinking that an executive order is going to solve everything. You really need to get everyone at the table and everyone invested and everyone bought in.
Rob, you were talking earlier about Salt Typhoon. I wonder, when you think about what is an obstacle to the U.S. maintaining its technological superiority on things like AI or staying ahead on networks, is the issue more Salt Typhoon, or is it obstacles we're putting in our own way? Is it more our own goals or external circumstances?
I'm always bullish on American technological innovation. I think we've got the brightest minds in the world, and as long as we keep our borders relatively open, I think we'll continue to attract those brightest minds. I mean, if you take a look at immigration flows, I don't see American entrepreneurs fighting to get into China, right? And The Economist, I'm not an economist, I don't work for The Economist, but they had a great podcast, 4-part podcast on how Chinese citizens are coming through South America, through some of the toughest land in the world to try to get into the United States for a better. Now, there's a variety of different reasons to come, but they're risking life and limb to come to the United States. I'm not seeing those flows go the other direction. So I'm extremely bullish on our innovation possibilities and our continued role in leading the world in using technology to make the world a better place. The challenge comes in this trust breakdown between industry and government. And we're not going, and we never should, try to replicate the China model where the Chinese government sits in and tells industry what to do and then immediately pulls that intellectual property into government and military purposes. But we do need to find a way to sit down more closely and open ourselves, both from the government side and the industry side, into sharing what's important to each one of us. Industry has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. Government has a responsibility, a social contract with its taxpayers. There is room in between those to drive cooperation, but as long as the government holds back what's truly important to it, and the private sector is not willing to take a little bit more risk in dealing with the government, we're not going to be able to have that cooperative, geostrategic, technological, and innovation development approach that we have to make sure that all this innovation is also in the interest of the federal government.
In the moments we have left, I was hoping I could do a rapid fire round, and if each of you could give me your top wish list, your top wish item of how you think the US could advance networks in the US, what sort of policy you'd like to see. Let's start with you, John.
Sure, instead of giving money to companies, favored companies, special companies, really, really smart companies with great stuff, create a market demand. Say, you want to do a 6G network or a private 5G network, we'll spend $5 billion to equip all of our military bases with it. Here's a contract ready for you to fill. You create that market signal, and I think companies will step up. Venture capitalists will put money in and say, if we invest in this, there's someone that's going to buy it. I think that's the fastest way to do it.
All right, market signals from John. Grace?
Yeah, actually, I think Rob is starting to go where I was thinking is just a richer relationship between the between the government and the private sector in all things that actually have to pertain with telecoms. For example, licenses for submarine cable landing stations, national security licenses are very, very difficult to come by. And it's difficult, particularly when the deployers are coming in and asking the national security agencies, is this arrangement okay with you? And the national security agencies say no, and they just have to go back and try again without further information. Those kinds of issues. And then, the sharing of information, threat information on cybersecurity, the sharing of information on what needs can be addressed by industry for government priorities. Having that sort of, I guess, it's almost what I think MITRE was probably dreamed of to address in its origins, but that kind of richer dialogue would be extraordinarily helpful in just moving, I think, the U.S. along in its innovation sector.
So richer dialogue between industry and the government. How about you?
I agreed with all that. Also the role of the White House to have a disciplined, consistent, perhaps imperfect approach, but disciplined and consistent and focused on convening all the stakeholders without thinking that they can, by themselves, dictate the results.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a stronger role for the White House. And Rob?
The reason the government right now has not played a stronger role is that the government doesn't think that the wireless network in the United States is truly of strategic importance. That's what it's always been. We've talked about the importance from a national security perspective, but I sat in the White House for years and I talked to wireless companies and cloud computing companies, and none of them could really show me what the added value is going to be for our economic development. They couldn't do it. Even today, the use cases are fairly small in the United States for what we're losing out on for 5G. And if you go to China, they're using 5G for a lot of things, but it's not a convincing argument to the federal government. So industry needs to get in. They need to convince the federal government that there's an economic reason for the government to become involved, and then industry needs to understand the national security importance, and they need to come together.
Okay. So a convincing argument from industry. This takes us to the end of our panel. I will say, as a DC journalist, it's a refreshing break to have a panel about networking that focuses not on swapping business cards, but on the race to stay ahead on connectivity. Grace Coe, Rob Blair, Tom Power, and Jon Pelson, thank you all so much, and thank you in the audience.